All right, good morning, everyone. We've got some folks still coming in from the waiting room, but we've got a lot of information to cover today, so we are going to go ahead and get started right away. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Abigail Phillips. I am KHRC's HOME-ARP Program Manager. First things first, the session is being recorded. This session will be available on our website after today. So the recording and the slides will be available to everyone after today's session. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and we'll go ahead and get going. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Just testing it out. I've had a little bit of technical difficulties this morning. Okay, so we are going to be talking about the HOME-ARP RFP and application today. We're super excited. We know a lot of you are too. We have been working on this program for about 18 months now, gathering information and getting ourselves ready to make an RFP and this application available to all of you so you can start requesting HOME-ARP resources. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to walk you through a brief overview of the HOME-ARP program, and I'll share that screen. So we'll be walking through a brief overview of the HOME-ARP program. We'll talk about the qualifying populations, and we'll have a conversation about the eligible activities that could be potentially funded with HOME-ARP. But a lot of you I know have already heard me give that spiel before, so we won't be taking a ton of time to go through that. But then after that, we'll get into the information I know a lot of you want to talk about, which is what's in the RFP, what's in the application, and what are the requirements to request HOME-ARP funds. So this is what we'll be talking about. I would ask that you save any questions to the end because I do have a lot of content I want to get through. So if we could hold questions, there will be a time for Q&A afterwards. So just hang in there and I promise we'll get to them. So starting with HOME-ARP. So the program provides $5 billion of supplemental home funds to assist individuals and households who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, or otherwise vulnerable to housing instability. The program is designed to provide housing, rental assistance, supportive services, and non-congregate shelter. The funding went to home participating jurisdictions, or PJs, who received home funding in 2021. So that was the criteria to have directly received HOME-ARP funds from HUD. You had to be a home PJ who received home funds that year. Kansas got $39,319,074, and that is divided across 6 different organizations in our state. The state PJ, which is the state of Kansas, KHRC is going to be responsible for distributing that portion of the HOME-ARP funds, and then the 5 local PJs, which are Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Wichita, and Johnson County. Of the total allocation to the state of Kansas, KHRC received $22.9 million. So that is what is going to be available to request. Finally, all these funds must be allocated by September 30th, 2030, or else they are subject to recapture by HUD. So let's talk about the qualifying populations. I'll be abbreviating them as QPs from this point forward. First, we have homeless, then at risk of homelessness, and then fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. And then the 4th population is what HUD is referring to as the others population. This is defined as where providing supportive services or assistance would prevent the family's homelessness or would serve those who are at greatest risk of housing instability. So that's one way to define it. The second, or that is the definition. The other thing I was going to mention was that veterans are also eligible for HOME-ARP assistance, but they are not a QP in and of themselves. They are mentioned in the CPD notice, which we will be talking about in a few minutes. But in order to receive assistance, veterans have to qualify under one of these 4 definitions. They are not eligible as a, veterans are not a QP status in and of themselves. So, in addition to this, HUD has designated 4 eligible activities that HOME-ARP funds can be used for. These are tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA, the development and support of affordable rental housing, supportive services, and then finally acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units. So those are the 4 official eligible activities. Up to 15% of the total allocation can go to the PJ themselves for the costs of administering the program. And then up to 10% of the funds can go to CHOTO and nonprofit operating and capacity building expenses. So what I'd like to do before moving into the RFP and application is really quickly going through each eligible activity individually, just so when we move into a discussion in the RFP and application, you have an idea of what your options are and what you can be asking for. So starting with the development and support of affordable rental housing, HOME-ARP funds can be used to acquire, rehab, or construct affordable rental housing primarily for individuals and families that meet the definition for one or more of the qualifying populations. Unlike the regular home program, which targets home-assisted rental units based on tenant income, 70% of all HOME-ARP units are going to admit households based only upon their status as a qualifying population or a QP. Eligible HOME-ARP rental housing includes housing as defined in 24 CFR 92.2, which includes manufactured housing, SRO units, and permanent supportive housing. Things like emergency shelters, hotels, motels, including those currently operating as a non-congregate shelter, things like that are not going to constitute housing under the HOME-ARP program. However, HOME-ARP funds can be used to acquire such facilities and rehab them to be HOME-ARP rental housing. In this eligible activity, the population served does not have to be 100% QP, like I mentioned before. We can use up to 30% of the units to serve low-income households. So 30% can go to low income, 70% can go to HOME-ARP. You of course have the option to do more than 70% of the units going to HOME-ARP households, but you don't have to. All right, so supportive services. Eligible costs under supportive services include childcare, education, employment assistance, job training. I'm not going to go through the whole list here because that would take far too much time. But I'm going to encourage you later in this presentation to look at the CPD notice, which does list and describe all of the different eligible activities that are eligible for supportive services funding, and that list is very extensive. So there are lots of different things you can do with these funds. Now, financial assistance cannot be provided to a program participant who is receiving the same type of assistance from another public source. So basically, we can't be duplicating these resources. There's also going to be a limitation on providing financial assistance to a participant who has been provided with certain types of replacement housing payments. Okay, non-congregate shelter units. A non-congregate shelter, or NCS, is one or more buildings that provide private units or rooms as temporary shelter to individuals and families. Sorry guys, I'm also trying to monitor the waiting room. We've got people who are still coming in. So HOME-ARP funds can be used to acquire and or rehab or construct HOME-ARP NCS units. The acquisition of vacant land or demolition of existing structures may be undertaken as part of the NCS project. Eligible costs are going to include acquisition, demolition, development hard costs, site improvements, related soft costs, and a replacement reserve. We can't use HOME-ARP funds for NCS to do, among other things, we can't pay operating costs, can't provide additional HOME-ARP assist or HOME-ARP investment during the restricted use period, and we can't pay for conversion costs. So I think, and I say this whenever I give this presentation, the most important thing to note here is that operating costs are ineligible for HOME-ARP funds under NCS. So if an organization elects to apply for an NCS project, they're going to need to demonstrate an ability to cover the operating costs during the restricted use period. So I want to talk a little bit about restricted use period versus minimum use period. So with NCS, there is a minimum use period, and during this time, all HOME-ARP NCS projects have to operate as NCS, and they can't be converted into some other form of housing. The minimum use periods are going to vary in length depending on the type of project you want to do. So if you are an acquisition only project, you're going to have a shorter minimum use period than if you did a whole new construction project. So we've got varying lengths of time for those minimum use periods. There is also a restricted use period, which begins at project completion. And during that restricted use period, the NCS project can be converted to other types of housing. And those restricted use periods are also going to vary in length, again, depending on the type of activity you decided to do, whether acquisition, rehab, new construction, etc. So again, if NCS funds are awarded, the grantees are going to need to be able to demonstrate that they can fund the operating costs through non-HOME-ARP sources for the full restricted use period. So this is where the eligible cost of a replacement reserve can come in handy. So we can't pay operating costs with HOME-ARP, but we can put that reserve aside potentially to help cover the replacements of certain items during the restricted or minimum use periods. Okay, and then finally, can you guys still see my screen? Yes, okay. In HOME-ARP TBRA, the PJ assists a qualifying household with payments to cover the entire or insufficient amounts that the qualifying household cannot pay for housing and housing-related costs, such as rental assistance, security deposits, and utility deposits. Eligible costs for HOME-ARP TBRA, which is a little bit different from the regular TBRA program, is going to include security deposit payments and utility deposit assistance to qualifying households. HOME-ARP funds can be used to pay for up to 100% of these eligible costs, and a PJ can use HOME-ARP TBRA funds to provide loans or grants to qualifying households for security deposits for rental units, regardless of whether the PJ provides any other HOME-ARP TBRA assistance. So the only other thing I want to mention here is that unlike the regular TBRA program, we can't use HOME-ARP funds to pay for the home buyer program that's defined in 24 CFR 92.209. So that is the last thing I wanted to mention there. So that was a review of HOME-ARP in general. That is HOME-ARP as we see it in CPD Notice 2110, which was HUD's overview of how the program was supposed to operate. Next, what I'd like to do is go through the RFP. I'm going to share my screen. We'll go through the RFP. We'll go through the application. I'll take you to the website because I want to point out some of the important things that I want applicants to be aware of heading into this application process. So let's see. Before we do that, I do want to point out these documents. Like I said, this PowerPoint and all the links in it are going to be available to all of you after this webinar is over. These are some important documents that you'll need in order to prepare your application. So the first document on here is the American Rescue Plan, which is the statute that HOME-ARP falls under. And then we've got HUD CPD Notice 2110, which I have mentioned multiple times. I will continue to mention it throughout this presentation. This is HUD's guidance on HOME-ARP. And then following this is KHRC's allocation plan, which is describing how KHRC is going to run our HOME-ARP project or our HOME-ARP program. And then of course we have the RFP on here too. So you should not just read the HOME-ARP RFP and the application. In order to understand how this program operates, you will need to read the CPD notice and the allocation plan. And I will, again, I'll say that throughout the rest of the presentation. These are documents you're going to need to know and understand in order to get a good idea of how the HOME-ARP program operates. So make sure, yes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second and pull up the RFP so you all can see it. Okay, Cynthia, can you tell me if you can see this?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute. Yes.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Okay. So first thing to point out here is our deadline. We're going to talk later about the different stages of the application process for HOME-ARP, but the first deadline for the program is the deadline for what we're referring to as preliminary applications, and those are going to be due on Monday, September 18th, 2023 at 5 p.m. So we released the RFP on June 26th. From June 26th to September 18th is 12 weeks. So applicants are going to have 12 weeks total to prepare their project and their applications. Next thing I want to do is move down to Section A. So as many of you already know, HOME-ARP is a one-time source of funds. So once it's gone, we won't be getting any anymore. So KHRC's allocation plan, as we point out here, is a one-time allocation of that 22.9 million. I think what I'm going to do is make this a little bit bigger. Selected applicants will be provided with technical assistance. So KHRC wants to make sure that we're funding the best projects with our allocation of HOME-ARP funds because they are limited. And so to do that, we want to make sure that we're setting all of our applicants up for success. This means that during the application process, we will be providing applicants with technical assistance. And when I say technical assistance or TA, I'm not referring to the office hours that we've got coming up. If applicants are approved to move past the preliminary application stage, so you've got an approved preliminary application, you're invited to submit a full application. KHRC is going to be offering you technical assistance to strengthen your proposal. Funds must be fully expended by September 30th, 2030. I mentioned this earlier. If we don't have funds expended by then, not just allocated, they are subject to recapture. So KHRC, once we get past the application period, will be determining an expenditure date that all funds will need to be drawn by so that we can make sure that KHRC, as the PJ, is meeting HUD September 30th deadline. And then finally, the allocation plan. So we've linked it here and you can see it on the HOME-ARP website. You can see it on the HUD Exchange. We have the plan available, and so we really encourage you to read it. Due diligence for applicants includes reading this plan as it's an overview of how we're going to be running this program and what we see as our priorities. So be sure you read that. It's not the last time you're going to hear me say that today. So let's move down to administration. So I will provide a list of HOME-ARP team members toward the end of this presentation, so you know who we are, you know who to reach out to. But your main contacts for this program will be myself. I know a lot of you have reached out to me about this program already, and then of course Doug Wallace, who is our ESG HOME-ARP program manager. You can, of course, email all of us at once by reaching out to the homearp@kshousingcorp.org email address. This is a newer, we opened this up about a month ago. And so I would encourage you, if you have questions, to go ahead and reach out to that email. So let's see. I know I said earlier that KHRC had a total allocation of that 22.9 million, but of that we will be awarding about 19.5. The rest of the difference between the 19.5 and the 22.9 is that 15% admin allocation the KHRC receives from HUD. And then we'll move on to eligible applicants. So I'm not going to read through all of these sections because then we'll never get out of here. But I want to be sure to point out some of the highlights, and the eligible applicants section, or section D, is one of them. So be sure you read this over so you can see who's eligible to apply. Because section D is definitely one you'll want to be aware of. So then we'll move down and we'll talk about eligible activities. Again, not going to read this over. We've already talked through it briefly, but do want to note that you'll see that we've linked the CPD notice for each one of these eligible activities. We've provided you the page number for each one so you know where to go. Like the allocation plan, you're definitely going to want to read through the CPD notice to make sure you understand the requirements of the HOME-ARP program, because a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with HOME and TBRA and ESG, and HOME-ARP is similar to a lot of those, but it's not exactly the same. It's bringing in some new definitions. It's changing some of the requirements, so you don't want to rely on what you know from those programs. You're going to want to know the HOME-ARP version of that as well. So, I'm going to move down to section G, which is the uses of KHRC funding. I will point out here that applicants can propose one or more or a combination of the different eligible activities. So you can see them listed out here, and you can see the percentage of HOME-ARP funding that's been allocated to them. You can see the exact numbers, the exact allocation amount for each of these eligible activities in the allocation plan itself. So you can apply for one of the activities, you can apply for all of them. The only one that is not going to be eligible as a standalone activity is the operating and capacity building expenses. So these two 5% allocations that you see down here. We've already talked about those a little bit, but you have to be already doing a HOME-ARP project in order to be eligible to receive those. So these are not going to be standalone. You have to already be doing at least one of these 4 up here in order to receive part of this 10%. Qualifying populations. Let's see. Again, already been through this, but also I'm going to say this over and over. Check out the CPD notice because some of these QPs, especially QP3, they don't exactly match some of the definitions that we're familiar with. So you're going to want to see what the CPD notice has, because some of these, like QP3, is a combination of different definitions from different programs. So be sure to check that out so you're familiar with it. And then we'll move down to the application process, and I'll zoom out a little bit so we can see this better. So this is a really important section, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here and point out several different things for you. First of all, you'll see here that the first thing we talk about is the preliminary application. So there are going to be, I want to be really upfront about this right now, there are going to be multiple different steps to this application process. It's not just going to be one application. But for the preliminary applications, the documentation you'll need to submit the preliminary app is included in attachments A and B of this RFP. So attachment A is going to point you to where to download the Excel version of the application, and attachment B is going to tell you what kind of attachments you're going to need to provide for us as supporting documentation for your request and application. Like we've talked about before, the preliminary apps are due on September 18th, and you're going to need to send those to the team at HOME-ARP@kshousingcorp.org. Don't send it to one of us individually. It needs to come to this email address. Then another important note you'll see down here, there is going to be no further notice to the public or opportunity to submit an application under this RFP after the application deadline. So KHRC anticipates fully allocating the HOME-ARP funds under this RFP. While there will be more than one step to the process, in order to be considered, every potential applicant needs to start with the preliminary application and submit them by the September 18th deadline in order to be considered. So only applicants who submit that preliminary application will advance. There won't be a place to jump in the middle if you miss that September 18th deadline. So if you want to apply for HOME-ARP funds, you're going to want to get your preliminary application in by the September 18th deadline. We're going to skip this blue section for a minute and come back to that because before we dig into it, I want to point out the different steps to the application process. So benchmarks. Benchmark 1 is your preliminary application. So to start this process, you need to submit that like we talked about. If your preliminary application is approved, then you are eligible to move on to the next step of the process, which is technical assistance and a full application. it may or may not also include a proposal presentation to our review team, which I'll also talk about. So then benchmark 2 down here, this is the full application. And as we note, everything you'll need in order to submit a successful application is going to be provided to you if your application is eligible to move on to the full application stage. So we don't have that information published right now, but it will be available to you later in the process. And we anticipate those full applications being due in February of 2024. So it's not going to be a super fast turnaround. You're going to have time to get those applications together. So then now circling back to these blue highlights up here. Again, everything you'll need will be provided for you regarding full applications if you are invited to submit a full application. And as I noted before, the full application process for some applicants can include a project presentation. So those presentations may be in person, they may be online and virtual, but we anticipate them being held late this year, which we also discussed down here in benchmark 1. So I know this is a lot of really new information, and we'll have time at the end for all your questions about it. So hang on to them. I promise I'll get to them, but be sure to review section I because this is really important in the RFP. So moving on, let's talk about the evaluation process. So first is that applicants that receive approval to submit a full application are going to need to demonstrate in their preliminary application that the proposed project is financially, legally, operationally viable. You can read all that. Like we've talked about, this is a one-time allocation of funds, and KHRC wants to make sure that we're funding projects that are going to have an impact for our QPs. Some of these projects like NCS are higher risk because of the limitations of HOME-ARP funds and how we can use them. So we're going to be reviewing applications to make sure that they're viable and sustainable, so we don't have projects that can't survive the stringent requirements. Also important to note, you will not be asked in the Excel application when you get in there, we're not going to ask you to provide a request amount in your application. The Excel application is not even going to give you a space to specify what you're asking for. This was not an oversight, this was intentional. We've talked a little bit about the TA that KHRC is going to give preliminary applicants who advance to the full application stage. And part of this TA is going to include an offer of what KHRC can provide the applicant in terms of resources based on the availability of funding. So you won't need to specify a request amount in your application. Keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to move past all that. Again, attachment A. This is the HOME-ARP preliminary application attachment. It's going to tell you where you can go to download the application. Because it's a spreadsheet, it's an Excel spreadsheet, we can't link it here. You have to go to that page to download it, but it has the information for you. If you struggle to find it, just let us know and we can point it out to you. Pretty straightforward. Then moving on to attachment B. So again, attachment B lists out all the required attachments for your applications. The first 2 pages are going to list documents that all applicants are required to submit regardless of what specific type of HOME-ARP funds you request, TBRA, NCS, rental, etc. If you are submitting a preliminary application, you must submit the documents listed under this all projects heading. So everybody is going to need to submit those documents. Then if you move down past that, you'll see that the 3rd page has information on specific HOME-ARP eligible activities, rental and NCS, supportive services, TBRA, etc. So you are only, once you submit the other documentation, once you get here, you're only going to submit the documents listed under the heading of the eligible activity you are requesting. So if you're requesting, for example, resources for a rental project, you would submit the documents under the all projects heading and the documents under the rental and NCS projects heading. If you are applying for all these activities, you'll need to submit all the documents. Attachment C, also straightforward. This is your list of evaluation guidelines, so take a look at that. This will explain to you what KHRC is going to be looking at when we're evaluating these applications. Then we're going to scroll down to attachments E and F of the application, because these are going to be two really important resources for you that we're providing. So as we've talked about, HOME-ARP is this weird combination of new activities and definitions and already existing activities and definitions. So because of that, our team developed a program comparison between the original versions of certain programs, HOME, TBRA, ESG, and we compared them to the HOME-ARP version of those programs. So this attachment is going to be useful to you. On one side, you're going to have the original. On the other side, you're going to have the HOME-ARP version. So we have rental, TBRA, and then ESG. So take a look at that. That's going to be useful to you. And then finally, attachment F. So we released a things to consider chart last year during the discussion process for HOME-ARP. This is an updated version. So if you have the old version, I'd encourage you to delete that and use this one, because this one is corrected and updated with information that you'll need. So that's that. That is all the information I wanted to see for I wanted to look at for the RFP. I'll pull up the application and we'll start looking at that. Okay, so I've zoomed into 150% here. It's a little bit distorted. If anybody is having trouble seeing it, feel free to drop it in the chat and let me know, and I'll try to zoom in a little bit more. But first thing I want to note is down here. I'm sorry, I can't actually zoom in any more than this.
Abby?
Yes, Doug.
We're still seeing the things to consider chart.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. Let's see if I can fix it. Okay, how about now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. All right. So I can't zoom in any more down here, but I do want to point out these tabs at the bottom first. So like attachment B in the RFP, there are different requirements depending on the type of funding you're requesting. So all projects are going to need to fill out this common application. Then you will fill out a tab for each of the eligible activities that you're going to be applying for. So again, if you're applying for rental resources, you would complete the common application tab and the rental and NCS requests tab as well. Again, if you're applying for all the activities, you want to fill out all the tabs. So moving on, so this first section, I've highlighted them in yellow here so I can remember to point them out to you. It's going to look a little bit different. It's not going to quite be so bright when you go and download it yourself. So these are the instructions for submitting the common application. A lot of this, eligible applicants, QPs, a lot of this is going to reiterate what you're already going to have seen in the RFP. But at the top, you have deadline and submission requirements and where to submit the application. So then if we go down to section 2, this is the project information section. You'll see here that this is where you'll indicate which of the 4 eligible activities you're applying for. And then below you'll list which of the 4 QPs you're hoping to serve. Then section 3 is your organization profile. So you'll be telling us a little bit more about what your organization already does with funding that you already have, a little bit of history on what your organization is set up to do. And then finally, at the bottom, section 4, application next steps. So this is your reminder that submitting only the common application tab may result in your application being marked as incomplete. So you'll want to be sure it's a reminder to complete any of the additional tabs that are related to your request in your resource. All right, so then moving on to the supportive services request. The first thing we have here is a list of the eligible costs under this section of the HOME-ARP RFP and the HUD CPD notice. So these are all the different things that HUD says you can do with supportive services funds. Again, you'll see that we've linked the CPD notice right here in the Excel application. It's not going to be enough to just read these, read this list of eligible costs. You're going to want to see the definitions of them in the CPD notice, so please be sure to read that. All of this, any of you who have requested ESG funds in the past before are likely going to be familiar with it. Down here at the bottom, I do want to point out that at the end of each of the eligible activity tabs, there's going to be a place for a signature. You'll need to submit a signature for each activity you're applying for. And like I said, there's a section at the bottom, one for each. You can sign these electronically, but also please feel free to just print this last page out, sign it with a wet signature, and then scan it and upload it with your required attachments if that would be easier. But again, like we talked about with the attachments and the different tabs, each activity is going to require a signature. So if you're applying for multiple eligible activities, you're going to need to submit multiple signatures. So, okay, so moving on to rental and NCS. The first thing I want to point out here is section 2, which is the source of funds section. So this is going to ask you to describe the funding that you either have for this project that you're applying for or that you are considering applying for. We've provided definitions of how you're going to want to identify each source of funds, whether it's committed, requested, or tentative. I think this is a good place to point out that, again, this is a preliminary application. You don't have to have the project 100% together, and you don't have to have all of your sources of funds secured. That's why we're doing this preliminary application. That's why we've given that 12-week window between releasing the RFP and the submission deadline, because we understand that it's going to take time for some organizations to form these partnerships if they haven't already. And some applicants may not have had those initial discussions with potential partners. And so what we do expect you to do is present a project that again is sustainable and that's viable. So demonstrate to us that you have the capacity and the experience, or are bringing in the capacity and the experience to successfully execute the project that you are proposing. So, for example, if your organization doesn't have experience executing the type of projects you're proposing, who are you consulting with? Who are you working with who does have that experience to help you make this a sustainable project? So that's why we're asking here that applicants just initially demonstrate the funds they may or may not have secured yet, that they may or may not be considering, so we have an idea of what types of funds could potentially be brought into this project. So you'll see when you scroll down, you'll be able to describe multiple different types of funding resources. So then let's move on to the development budget. So that's section 3. You'll have 2 columns that you'll need to complete. You'll want to complete the total development cost column and the HOME-ARP units cost column. So total development cost, of course, is all the different types of costs that are going to go into this project. And then this column should list all of the costs from the first column that you would like to use for HOME-ARP, or you would like your HOME-ARP funds to pay for. So be sure to complete both columns here. It's not enough to complete just one. And then, of course, we go down to the bottom and you have your applicant agreement. Then finally, we'll move on to the TBRA request. Again, if you've applied for TBRA in the past, most of this is going to be pretty familiar to you. I did just want to point out that this budget was pulled from the from the original TBRA application. Because it's in Excel, we were able to do some, words are failing me. It's going to calculate the costs for you. Once you start entering information into this budget, it's going to calculate in these highlighted columns the costs for some of these things. So some of the cells will be pre-populated once you start entering information. Okay, let's see. Then finally, we'll look at the HOME-ARP website. I will stop talking and we will move on to Q&A. Okay. Doug, would you let me know when you can see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. So real quick, touch on this. The HOME-ARP website has been updated recently, so we'll start up at the top. You have the about information on HOME-ARP that gives you a general overview. You have your next steps, which is the preliminary applications, and then you have all your staff contacts over here, depending on what type of project you'd like to apply for. So lots of different resources for you, lots of different team members you can contact. Then you have the upcoming webinar. So this is the webinar from today, and then we have office hours on July 18th and 26th, and then August 15th and 30th, so we can answer more specific questions about the projects you're considering. And then lastly, down here, we have the HOME-ARP request for proposal. We have the preliminary application that you can download, and then the final allocation plan. All the HOME-ARP recordings and presentation materials that we did last year are still available. We've moved them down to this banner. So if you want to access them, they are still a resource for you. Okay. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if anyone has questions. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, I have a question. On the for the non-congregate living, is it problematic if a site has not been selected yet? And I'm assuming that obviously if you are hoping to use the ARP money for acquisition of property, obviously you would not have acquired the property yet, correctly? Or correct?
Right. So are you asking, so there's a couple different things here. So you're talking about a site not being identified or not being acquired.
Well, I guess acquired.
Okay, yes, so that's not going to
be... Let's say a program is looking at properties in town but hasn't selected a property.
Mm-hmm.
How would a program go about putting that in their application, that they're looking at some possibilities but have not purchased anything yet? And I'm assuming that if we want to use the money for acquisition, we cannot have already purchased the property.
Right. So if you want to use the money for acquisition, correct. You'll want to have not purchased the property. If you have not identified a site yet, I think that's one of the things, again, that's going to speak to, since this is a preliminary application, that will speak to the sustainability of the project. I'm looking at the HOME-ARP rental and NCS request section of the application now. So it does ask if a site has been identified. Do you have site control? And I'll share my screen so you can see this. Let's see. Okay, so it'll ask you for site information. Do you have site control and other information? But if there are multiple sites that you're considering, I would just really encourage you to make sure that when you submit the documentation for your backup, those attachments and attachment B, make sure that it's clearly explained, you know, these are the sites we're looking at and things like that. So,
okay.
Yep.
So if we had more than one site, I'm assuming we would fill out that for more than one, for each site that we're considering?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And by September, we may have picked it. I don't know.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay.
Preliminary application. Yes.
Abigail, what does it look like for joint application if two organizations wish to partner in on either non-congregate shelter developments, where one helping lead in site selection, developing the non-congregate sheltering or low-income housing, and another one wishes to do expand their operation services. Just, I guess, that type of partnership and collaboration. What does that look like?
Good question. So are you talking about, just to make sure I understand, so your two organizations are coming into this project together. One is applying for the rental and NCS. The other is requesting solely capacity building expenses. Is that what you're asking?
Capacity expenses to maybe assist in the service operations of the new congregate shelter.
Good question. We would have to talk about that. First of all, we haven't talked a lot about applicants coming in together. I don't see a real issue with that. That's an interesting way to look at it. We can talk about that. I don't know for sure how it would work if one organization, even if they apply together, is saying, well, we only want the rental and NCS, while we want the capacity building resources. So I've noted that down. We'll talk about that because that's a good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I should point out,
Abigail,
guys.
this is Carolyn Moore.
Mhm.
Okay,
Hi,
so we are thinking new construction, but also seeing how we could do a non-congregate shelter. There is a home that borders our current non-congregate shelter.
Mhm.
We were considering possibly applying to be able to purchase it to make a buffer between our cottages and the rest of the community, as well as giving us a home that would shelter families larger than parents with 2 kids, which is currently all we can do in the cottages that the shelter that we have. Would I fill out 2 proposal summaries under the application tabs? Would I do 2 of those? Because under project type, there is a spot for new construction. Then there's a spot for acquisition and rehab. And the address and everything about them is going to be different based upon those 2 projects.
So let me make sure I'm understanding this. So this is going to be a combined project, or they're going to be 2 separate things, a rehab over here and a new construction over here, or are they together?
Nope, they're about a block apart, but they would
Okay.
be 2 separate projects.
Okay. Then Barry and team, please feel free to jump in. I suspect that's going to be 2 separate applications since they're not connected in any way. That's probably going to be 2 entirely separate applications.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I just want to make sure I know what I'm filling out.
Sure, absolutely.
you.
Yes.
Abigail, I have a question about the rental assistance.
Mhm.
We have potential to be interested in both rental assistance and supportive services, and noting that you can request short-term to medium-term financial assistance for rent. I know there's a lot of details in the some of the documents, but can you give a little more information, like what would be advantages, disadvantages of doing a separate TBRA versus just the supportive services and adding rental assistance on there?
Good question. Cynthia, Doug, and Shyla, I'd welcome you to jump in here, but I don't know that there would be necessarily an advantage or a disadvantage to that. That's just 2 different ways of requesting what sounds like it would be pretty much the same thing. So, Doug?
Yeah, I agree, Abigail. I don't think there's an advantage or disadvantage. I would just encourage you to review the CPD notice, because both programs there are differences between TBRA and the supportive services. So I just encourage you to read the notice to see which one best fits the project that you're wanting to create.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question in the chat that I'll jump in on. So the question is, if we have projects that are not in the same city but are in the same county, would this qualify? So for example, we have an organization that is wanting to help the food banks in each city in the county. Would this be eligible? So I would say, yes, that is potentially eligible. So my understanding, it sounds like you have got one organization that wants to provide, who wants to administer a project in multiple separate cities. I don't see that being ineligible at all. Again, it depends on your application, but yes, that would be something we would consider. Other questions?
When you say that there's some office hours, tell me a little bit about what that means.
Sure. Let's see. All right, I'm going to share my, well, no, I'm not. So our staff, again, we want to make sure that we're setting everyone up for success. We understand that this is a really new program. Folks are coming in with some experience with the original programs, but not necessarily with a complete understanding of what HOME-ARP is or is designed to do. So when we have those office hours, we're going to get our team together. We're going to have somebody who knows about TBRA, someone who knows about supportive services, et cetera. And so we'll be able to answer specific questions about your applications, such as your question about, well, what if I haven't selected a site yet? What if I want to spend funds to acquire the site? Do I need to have purchased it beforehand? Those are the types of questions that I would encourage being brought to the office hours or being asked today. Because we can't review these preliminary applications prior to submission, but we do want to make sure that we are giving you all the information that you need in order to submit a successful application. So that's what the office hours are for. And I do have links. Again, they're available on the website. We'll be sending out reminders via email. And there'll also be links when I post the presentation slides, there will be links in there for you to register for them. So
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we can call anytime, but those are the times when all the experts are going to be together and might be more efficient use of everyone's time. Is that right?
Right. So
Gotcha.
always feel free to call us, email us, etc. But yes, you will have all of us in the same room and you will be a captive audience. So feel free to bring your questions then.
Abby, do you want me to post your cell number in case people want to call you after hours?
Sure, Barry. Why don't you do that?
So circling back to the question about activities in multiple communities, I think if you go to a lot of the definitions in HOME-ARP follow those of the HOME program. So if you go to the HUD Exchange and look at the HOME regulations, the HOME definitions, project means a site or sites together with any building, including manufactured housing units, etc., or buildings located on the sites, singular or plural, that are under common ownership, management, and financing. That's kind of the basic requirements there. Their basic definition of a singular project. Project includes all the activities associated with the site and building, and for TBRA, it just says it means assistance to one or more families. So they're, I think a site that involves multiple, or a project that involves multiple sites would be fine, as long as it's clearly defined as all being part of that same project.
Thanks, Barry. So we have about 5 minutes left to this meeting. I will share the final few screens of the presentation now, and you can continue to think about any questions that you may have. But
Abigail, can you tell us again where on the KHRC website we're going to find this information?
I will absolutely do that. So number one, I will post the link to that website. It is in the presentation slides. I will also post it in the chat here so you all have it. So once you go to the website that I've just put in the chat, the first thing that you'll see, let's see, share. Okay, so this is what's going to come up. You'll scroll down past all of this information to the bottom section, which is documents, forms, and resources. The first document on here is the request for proposal, and the second one is the preliminary application. So that's where to find that. You'll also, of course, the allocation plan is listed here. We don't have the CPD notice listed on our website, but it is going to be linked. There is a link to HUD's website in the slideshow that will show you where to find that CPD notice. So we will provide that to you. Okay. So I do want to share these last few slides with you. So this is our HOME-ARP team. We've got a great team running this program. So in addition to myself, we've got Barry McMurphy, our MIH program manager, Doug Wallace, who does ESG and HOME-ARP, Cynthia Howerton, who does first-time homebuyer and TBRA. She will be, congratulations, Cynthia, retiring pretty soon. So in her place, we're going to have Shyla Rocket, who will be helping us with TBRA. So all of our contact information is listed on the website, so you'll be able to reach us directly via email or by phone then, or you can, of course, reach out to the HOME-ARP email. And then the last thing on here is, of course, a link to the HOME-ARP page. All of our information will be released via email. All the announcements are going to come through the subscription link. So if you want to subscribe to HOME-ARP emails so you can get those reminders, I would encourage you to do so. And then, of course, our shiny new HOME-ARP email address. So all of that is available to you and will be posted shortly. So if there are no further questions, thank you all for your time. Thank you all for your interest in this program. We're really excited to roll it out for all of you and get this funding source to your community. So thank you for your time today. Feel free to reach out to us over the next few weeks. And we'll see you later. Thanks, everyone.